Others are absolutely delighted.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, ko Susana Leata with tēnei. Ports of Auckland's chief executive is refusing to step down despite a scathing review of health and safety failings at the ports. The review, released publicly this morning, was commissioned by the Auckland Council, which owns the company. Kate Gregan reports.
The review says the company needs to prioritise safety over productivity and profitability. But Chief Executive Tony Gibson says it has already been doing that over the past year. The Maritime Union says a change of leadership is crucial and Mr Gibson must resign. But he says that although he felt sick when he saw the report, he wants to stay in the job to fix all the problems it highlights. Ko Kate Gregan, TNA.
The brother of a Ports of Auckland worker who died on the job is also calling for Mr Gibson's resignation. Tua Dyer, whose brother Laboom was killed in a straddle crane accident in 2018, says the chief executive must step down so the problems can be fixed. There have been 3 workplace fatalities in as many years at the ports. Mr Dyer says it's Mr Gibson's fault the necessary changes to protect workers' lives weren't made. Managed isolation and quarantine has brought in a raft of changes for MIQ guests being taken to exercise. 14 people at Auckland's Grand Millennium Hotel had to stay longer in isolation after sharing a bus ride with a guest later found to have COVID-19. Yesterday it was revealed some passengers were not wearing masks and others didn't stay in their bubble or moved seats on the return journey. The head of MIQ, Jim Bliss, says passengers will now be told to wear masks correctly and sit in the same seat going both to and from the exercise site. 2-door buses will be used and drivers will have to wear N95 masks. The Green Party says it's heartbreaking to learn the government approved the export of military weapons to the United Arab Emirates. The UAE is a key partner in Saudi Arabia's war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. The Greens Foreign Affairs spokesperson Golriz Ghahraman says she is sceptical of the Foreign Ministry's assertion the exports are not being used in the Yemen war.
The problem I have with what MFAD have said, which is to say that they've assessed that what they were permitting to be sold to the UAE military wasn't going to be used in the war in Yemen, can't really be verified.
RNZ revealed this morning that the 2018 and 2019 approvals for hardware included targeting systems for mortars and suppressors. A Pike River family member says going deeper into the mine would have been too big an undertaking. The Family Reference Group, which represents most of the bereaved families, has accepted there will be no more government money for extending the mine recovery project. Rowdy Drewbridge, whose son Dan Herc was one of those killed, says it makes sense to go no further.
It'd be like starting all over again, like with your mine plans, getting signed off with health and safety, the Mines Inspectorate of New Zealand, involving international experts on the planning. And that in itself would take 2 to 3 years.
The police say they are still forensically examining the drift and new boreholes will be drilled. The head commissioner at the Tauranga City Council says the city's community facilities are the worst she's seen in her 3 decades in governance. Former National MP and Cabinet Minister Anne Tolley, who's leading a team of 3 other commissioners, says she is shocked by the lack of investment.
In my 30 years in politics, I don't think I've ever seen a community that has been so poorly served for the people who live here with their community facilities. I could not believe the lack of investment.
Today, the commissioners met business leaders at a hui facilitated by the Tauranga Chamber of Commerce. It's 4 minutes past 5. New Zealand Rugby is confident a financial deal it calls transformational will get across the line despite opposition from leading players. The proposed $465 million agreement gives US technology investment company Silver Lake a 15% stake in New Zealand Rugby's commercial rights. A group of senior All Blacks and Black Ferns wrote to NZR in January outlining their concerns, but the letter only became public this week. RNZR Chief Executive Mark Robinson says he has since spoken with the players and progress has been made.
What I'm hearing is that it was at a time and place, some time ago now, and things have changed markedly in terms of the amount of information available to consider. What it says to me is that per those conversations, they remain very open-minded.
Mark Robinson says he'll meet with the Players Association again tomorrow for further discussions. Australia have set New Zealand a target of 130 in the second T20 Cricket International in Napier. Australian opener Beth Mooney top scored for the visitors with an unbeaten 61. Frankie Mackay was the pick of the New Zealand bowlers, taking 2 for 20 off her 4 overs. A short time ago, the White Ferns were 41 for 2 after 8 overs. The Black Caps' second T20 against Bangladesh is due to start at 7 o'clock, and a win would give them a 9th consecutive home series victory. That's the news.
Questions?
Saudi and UAE have been complicit with a number of crimes. No one should be trading with anyone engaged in this conflict.
Trials?
The entire video roll was played, including those harrowing sounds of George Floyd telling officers that he was in distress.
Acceptance?
We would all love to go further. I would give my right arm to have the remains of my son back. For the majority of us, we realise that enough is enough.
Daily News Morning Report weekdays from 6 till 9 on RNZ National.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, outbreaks of rain, heavy and possibly thundery with possible downpours at times, especially north of Auckland. Clearing to isolated showers tomorrow afternoon. Coromandel to Manawatu, including Bay of Plenty, Central High Country and Wairatapa. Periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms and downpours. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, a few showers, more frequent tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough. Periods of rain with some heavy falls tonight and again tomorrow night. Possible thunder. Canterbury, cloudy with patchy drizzle, turning to rain inland tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, cloud and some patchy rain developing tonight. Fine spells and the odd shower tomorrow. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland mainly fine. A few inland showers clearing tonight, but late rain tomorrow for Bulla, possibly thundery. Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional rain. RNZ National. It's 7 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora, this is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen Takuingwa. The family of one of the men killed at Auckland Ports wants the CEO to resign following damning revelations into the port's safety culture. Systemic problems have been revealed in an independent report out today, with much of the blame laid with management and the chief executive. The ports have been plagued by safety concerns in recent years, including 3 deaths as well as serious injuries. The port's boss, Tony Gibson, says he didn't know the extent of all the issues. Our reporter Nita Blake-Person and cameraman Nick Monroe filed this report.
A struggling port and an unsafe workforce. That's the stark picture painted in a report out today, where profits are put ahead of people, with several paying the ultimate price.
I think it's utterly unacceptable that you build profit or productivity on the backs of injuries and deaths of workers. No industry accepts that that should happen, including the ports, and they need now to address what was a serious situation.
Mayor Phil Goff commissioned the independent report after Amo Kalati was killed at the ports last August, the 3rd death linked to the council-owned company in as many years. Today's report didn't pull any punches.
There are systemic problems in Ports of Auckland Limited in relation to critical health and safety risk management and organisational culture related to health and safety.
There are 45 recommendations for port staff to work through, with much of the responsibility squarely on the man in charge.
A requirement on the Chief Executive to prioritise safety over productivity and profitability, to actively promote safety and better engage with employees on it, to change risk behaviour and to resource corrective actions.
Ports Chief Executive Tony Gibson today said he didn't know about the issues outlined in the report and was shocked to read them.
It made me feel sick, and again I felt a moral obligation to find out why this is happening and make sure that I can lead a program of work that delivers on the recommendations. I didn't know about them, and that's a sad indictment.
But Checkpoint has been raising concerns about safety at the ports of Auckland for months, with Tony Gibson responding with this during an interview in December.
We have a large Pacific Island Māori community, and very often they are what I would call shy in coming forward to address issues.
Tony Gibson's comments have been rejected by port staff who say they were racist, and they've been repeatedly ignored when raising safety issues. They include Tua Dyer, whose brother Laboom was killed in an accident at the ports in 2018. He worked there for years but left last year due to safety concerns. Tua Dyer says Tony Gibson is the man who created the problems at the port.
He's been in charge of this since accidents started really happening, isn't it? So it's he's the language to fix anyway.
And he needs to take responsibility.
Yeah, well, it's his fault. Like, everything's like that anyway. I mean, he's supposed to be the man in charge, and like, why is he not hiring like extra safety people to come and investigate like the ports and make changes?
But Tony Gibson says he won't be walking away.
No, I haven't considered resigning because I think that would be accepting the fact that. No, I'll turn it around. My focus is actually making sure that the wrongs that have been done here are put right. And I take full responsibility for that. And provided the board have got faith in me to actually deliver, I'll stay. The moment they don't have faith, that's the time I will leave.
And the board chair, Bill Osborne, says Gibson is the right man for the job.
We have confidence in Tony and senior management's commitment to drive forward on every single recommendation on this report. We will hold the Chief Executive accountable for these changes to be implemented over time, right? So once we've got that roadmap and the timelines associated with it, Tony accepts responsibility for getting this done.
Phil Goff says he will be holding the board to account, and recent additions are focused on health and safety. But those aren't his only concerns.
I'm also concerned that the ports have had over a number of years a declining return on equity invested in the report, are paying a declining dividend and are losing their competitiveness in the ports market in New Zealand. Those are all problems that need to be fixed.
Problems that need to be prioritised to ensure people are kept safe ahead of the port's profit. For Checkpoint, Corneta Blakeperson, Aho.
And listening to that was Craig Harrison from the Maritime Union. Good evening, Craig.
Good evening.
So who needs to take responsibility for the shortcomings laid out in that report?
Well, obviously it starts at the governance, and the governance is the board. So the board and the chair need to take responsibility that they haven't managed the situation, not for a couple of months, but for a couple of years. The board have been behind the prioritising productivity over safety, and that's come out in this report. Then cascading down, the CEO, when he admits that he didn't know he had this problem in this port, it sort of gives a point that straight away he doesn't know what's happening in his port anyway, regards to health and safety. So it stops with the CEO, as you heard from one of our members earlier on. And the comments he made about Pasifika members not raising health and safety issues a few weeks back was very unhelpful. But it actually sets the tone for how he sees his port running, as if the people working there are not raising these points, which he's not correct on. He'd be well aware that our union has taken the Ports of Auckland to the Employment Relations Authority and seek compliance over some health and safety procedures around the amount of hours being worked. And that was, we got a clear decision now that the Employment Authority of the port company was wrong and they had to comply.
So Craig, Tony Gibson says he's going to stick around, he's going to lead these changes. Can you work with him? Is he the person to do this?
Well, I struggle to see what's going to change. Nothing. We've been advocating for this change since the death of Laboom. And prior to Laboom's death, we were also advocating changes because of numerous injuries that were happening on the port. Unless he's going to complete about face and change how he's operating, I can't see how we can work with it. And by extension, it's the members of ours that work inside the port have little confidence that the CEO and the senior management team are about to change overnight or change in the near future.
So should Tony Gibson go, in your view, then?
Well, I think so. I'll give you an example that about 2 years ago we had one of our members, a young member, who was caught on a cell phone inside a straddle carrier. That member lost their job, and the port company, in the letter, they state they lost trust and confidence in this worker, and then it's a serious breach of health and safety. Therefore, that worker lost their employment. So that worker paid the ultimate price and was sacked. This CEO has got 3 deaths associated under his management. And recently you would have seen the report that was tabled at the ports at the Auckland City Council, that there's recently been 4 lost time incidents while they've still been under investigation of the last death. So how does a worker get held to a higher account than the management? So when you look at the scale of what's been going on and you look at the recommendations, I think it's 45 recommendations. That is telling that the CEO and the senior management team have little control of what was going on in their port.
The report also highlights a, quote, dysfunctional relationship between management and the Maritime Union. Why is there so much bad blood?
Well, I suppose it comes back for a history that our union will advocate as strong as we can for our memberships. So I've taken Ports of Auckland to the Employment Relations Authority and reinforcing that the Ports of Auckland follow their own health and safety guidelines, which they were in breach of their hours of work policy. If that's been dysfunctional, we'll continue to be dysfunctional if it means that we prioritise our members' health over the port's profit.
So, can you categorically say that the union has not been blocking or undermining safety changes because you don't support automation or for any other political reason?
Our union has never blocked health and safety. Our union has advocated strongly under health and safety. Our union is out there advocating that instead of compelling workers to do 60-hour weeks, that they trim it down to like a 52-hour week. Our union will stand by its record in the Employment Relations Authority, will stand by its record and chasing prosecutions for employers breaching health and safety.
So how are you guys going to work together then? What is the way forward here?
Well, I think it's a council-owned operation. It'd be helpful if there was some way to facilitate it and get back to what should have been for years and years on the waterfront, safety first. I worked down that port for numerous years, and I've never seen so many deaths.
Appreciate your time this evening. That's Craig Harrison there from the Maritime Union. It is 17 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National, and still to come on the program.
There has to be accountability for what has happened, and frankly, if the leadership of the Ports of Auckland is not prepared to recognise that what has happened is unacceptable and to make changes, then in my view they shouldn't continue in their roles.
Workplace Minister Michael Wood with his take on the report and a word of advice for Ports of Auckland. Well, calls tonight for an investigation into an alleged human trafficking ring in New Zealand following the arrest of a group of Chinese nationals working illegally at an Auckland building site. 9 of the men are still in Mount Eden jail awaiting deportation following the bust last week. Another man has been separated from the group. Immigration New Zealand says none of the men had work visas and some had overstayed by more than 3 years. The lawyer for the 9, Matt Robson, says the workers paid big money to an agent who arranged their travel and jobs. He says they're victims of exploitation who should be protected and kept in the country to give evidence.
They're in remand at Mount Eden. They were originally in police cells, and the plan there from Immigration New Zealand was to have them out of the country as quickly as possible, and that's normal practice. But for all sorts of reasons, COVID and others, it's taking longer for immigration to fulfil their plan.
Is that the right place for them? What should happen in your view?
They're exploited workers. They fit under all the criteria that the government set out in a very much trumpeted migrant exploitation policy of last year, telling workers in this situation that they're working on a visa that doesn't allow them to work, if they're not being paid properly, and so forth. They can come forward and they will be treated fairly and most likely be given a visa, not kept in prison. So it's the wrong place and it's a breach of the government's own policy.
So what are you doing about that?
Well, I've written to the people responsible, the responsible ministers. The first responsible minister is, of course, the Minister of Immigration, because deportations come under him. But the Associate Minister, Phil Twyford, is also a responsible minister because he operates what's called Section 378 of the Act, which gives him all the power in the world to release these workers and do the right thing. I've also written to the Minister of Foreign Affairs because human trafficking comes in. The workers told us that they'd pay between, I think, around about $10,000 to $30,000, depending, to agents in China. They must have then had contacts in New Zealand to get visitors' visas and then brought these workers here, and then they're distributed around various employers around Auckland. So there's a whole lot of questions to ask in the Ngāi Mahuta, because the trafficking involves, the Convention on Trafficking and our own law involves China as a country. I'm fairly sure she'd want to make sure that it was upheld and talk to her Chinese counterparts of what they can do at their end to investigate these matters. But plus, they're entitled to consular assistance. And nowhere can I find, immigration may tell me, that the Chinese consul has been contacted to give these foreign nationals that type of support as well.
So, Matt, to be clear, as far as you are concerned, these are trafficked workers.
Of course they are. Not insulting your question. They are, because if they're paid money and they're paid it to agents to bring them for the purpose of working here, they don't speak English, they don't know the law. They just put their hands in their fate in hands of these people. We have declared law, policy, international commitments to end trafficking. And if people are trafficked, they're then supposed to be assisted, not shoved into jail. And, I've been given a whole lot of flannel, and so have some of the others, like a couple of MPs are asking questions, that they had legal assistance. Well, it's just nonsense. The only legal assistance they got was a cursory, we'll read your rights in English, give them a list of lawyers in English, no cell phones. How on earth do they get legal assistance in that way? It's just nonsense.
I want to talk about the conditions that they have been working in. Did they have contracts? Were they being paid minimum wage? Are they owed money?
Right. Let me tell you that. None of them have advised us they had contracts, no employment contracts. That's one of the first policies under migrant exploitation policy that allows you to come forwards. No wage and time records, and the amounts vary. I've only been able to spend 2 hours, so I haven't been able to investigate, and immigration should be investigating this on behalf of the public. They've got more resources to do it, but it seems that they were paid anywhere between $8 and $10 an hour to maybe up to 27. Because they're obviously skilled workers in construction. No tax, no records, no bank accounts. The whole works in terms of exploitation.
Did they all work for the same company?
No, they seem to be. I'm not to the bottom of this. This is why it needs an investigation. They seem to have various ways that people pick them up, and different subcontractors got them. Some of them got there under their own steam. Others reported to myself and the union representatives who were there that they were picked up at certain points and then just dropped home. There seems to be a bit of a network in Auckland that looks after these people. So it seems to me, just surmising, that there's some arrangement with the Chinese side of it as to how they're looked after here. They don't speak a word of English. They've got no contacts here. They've got no family. They just arrive. So they're in the hands of a number of people.
Did they arrive as a group or individually?
No, it's a very good question. I asked them that to see. They all seem to have arrived differently. A couple of them know each other in China, so there's a connection there. But they all seem to have been recruited. But they arrived around the same time. I think they arrived, but only having had 2 hours with them. Those are the questions that the officials should be asking, so that they can have a successful prosecution. But immigration is more concerned to get them out of the country, get rid of the bodies. So who's going to be the witnesses to get the people who have been exploiting them?
The way you describe it there, Matt, is that there is some kind of underground network that is exploiting workers, foreign workers who have no right to be here, passing them from one employer to the other, not giving them wage contracts, not giving them proper working conditions, and then they are being spirited onto the next worker when that job runs out.
Yes, and immigration went to various sites around Auckland at the same time on the same day and got them. So immigration must have information from somebody somewhere where these people are. It's very difficult to say they're in a scattered number of sites from what they tell me. The second thing that immigration should be doing is working with one of the unions, the CTU, if they want to know which union, because that's part of the policy to protect these workers, get them some representation, not just say, you've breached the visa, out you go. And it's abominable, and as a former minister myself, I can understand how ministers can stand by while their own policies and laws and commitments are being breached.
How big is this exploitation network then? Because what you've described takes a fair amount of coordination.
Yes, I think it does. I can't, I don't have the resources to know exactly who and where, and I don't speak Chinese. But from what I'm told by the union that's investigated a number of these issues, and by clients of various types, yes, there's people who do this and take money for passing people on, etc. So it needs a thorough investigation with the resources of the state.
So potentially there are human traffickers here in New Zealand?
Yes, and liaising with people in other countries. In this case, China.
How were these workers when you went to see them in jail?
Confused, scared, had no idea of the difference between prison staff, police, immigration, had no idea what their rights were. When asked, they mentioned lawyers, we had no phones. Remember, I was getting this through translation. Their phones were taken. They haven't been able to communicate with their families. And while we were there, the police arrived to take one of the workers onto a plane that night.
So this is a 10th worker, because there were 10 originally?
Yes. Interesting you say that, because one of the workers was a close friend. He said, well, I'm really worried. Where's my friend? He's not here. So we deduced that will be the 10th worker, who seems to be held as some sort of prize captive in secret somewhere. I don't know if he's got any representation himself, as some sort of crown witness. And so they probably, it seems to me, that immigration have worked out they only need one witness. The rest of them conveniently get them out of the country. And because there's a lot of questions to ask that will be very interesting to Immigration New Zealand. How does this network work? How were they recruited? How do they get visitors visas? I mean, as a lawyer who does this, it's hard to get visitors visas from non-visa-free countries. Very hard.
And that's Matt Robson. Immigration New Zealand says it won't comment while the investigation is ongoing. The father of one of the Pike River victims is considering legal action against the government for not going further inside the mine. The family reference group, representing most of the 29 victims, says it accepts advice from the government that there will be no more money to expand the project. The minister in charge, Andrew Little, says the government has achieved its objective, but as Anand Zaki reports, a prominent family member is deeply unhappy about the situation.
Bernie Monk lost his son Michael in the 2010 disaster. He isn't part of the family reference group, but he's frustrated with the group for accepting the government's position to not go beyond the mine drift and into the mine workings. The decision was made at a meeting last night. Bernie Monk isn't happy he didn't get a say.
We're not just going to lay down and roll over like they want us to, like the FRG have done, have rolled over and just made all the decisions without discussing it in our family situation. And we've continuously asked them to do that, and yet they've banned us from all the meetings.
Mr Monk says he has been left with two options. Either take legal action against the government for not going further in the mine, or fund the recovery operation themselves. While he isn't yet clear on which option to pick, one thing is certain, that he feels the men inside are being let down. Mr Monk says the families shouldn't be too quick to put their faith in the police without recovery workers having a detailed examination of the fan area of the mine. He says having a look at the fan will unearth crucial evidence.
We've got the same police, the number of police doing the investigation that did it the first time, and they didn't do it properly then. So what's going to make them do it properly this time when they're not going into the fan area, which is only 9 metres away?
Police say their investigation into Pike River is ongoing. Andrew Little says what he told the families last night was nothing new. In a statement to RNZ, he said the government has delivered on its promise to safely recover the Pike River mine drift. He says the mandate of the recovery agency, which was to recover the drift, has not changed, and the drift is now being forensically examined. But Bernie Monk says Mr Little has a lot to answer for, given he previously spoke about how safe the mine was while he was at the Engineering, Printing and Manufacturing Union.
Yeah, he made a mistake and has admitted that. Then he comes along and he marches up to Blackpool with us every year with the unions, putting his fist in the air and saying, solidarity, we're going to help you guys, we're going to do everything for you to get your men out. And here we are, now he's the Minister of Recovery of the mine, he's pulling the pin. I can't accept it.
Rowdy Durbridge, who's part of the family reference group, lost his son Dan Herc in the disaster. Mr Durbridge, who is a former Pike River miner himself, says Andrew Little made it clear that there was no more money to get past the rockfall and that it would be a huge undertaking.
We had the agency telling us about initially what they'd have to do in order to get through the fall, and it'd be like starting all over again, like with your mine plans, getting signed off with health and safety, the Mines Inspectorate of New Zealand, involving international experts and on the planning, and that in itself would take 2 to 3 years.
Rowdy Durbridge says while his heart can't accept it, the 29 miners inside wouldn't want such vast amounts of money spent on the operation, when it could be spent elsewhere like housing and healthcare. He says he's hopeful about a prosecution. For Checkpoint, Anand Zaki.
Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, making the change or move on, that's the message for Auckland Port bosses from the Workplace Safety Minister. The push to get more Māori and Pasifika midwives, and the traffic experiment driving some people to extremes. We would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. Do get in touch if you work at the port. Let us know what your thoughts are on the safety review. You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is time now for the headlines with Susanna.
The Chief Executive of Ports of Auckland is refusing to step down in the wake of a damning report into safety. 3 people have died in as many years during incidents related to the port. The brother of Laboom Dyer, who died when his straddle carrier tipped in 2018, says CEO Tony Gibson failed to make changes to protect workers' lives. However, Mr Gibson says he feels a moral obligation to put the situation right. An Auckland man will be sentenced in June after being found guilty of murder. J. Christopher Lingman shot Denver Chance in the head 3 times in 2019 before sawing his body into pieces and putting them in a freezer. When the verdict against him was delivered in the High Court in Auckland today, Mr Chance's supporters were warned by Justice Harland to tone down their shouts of approval. Forestry export prices are reaching 3-year highs at the same time as some New Zealand building supply companies are experiencing timber shortages. Exporter Alan Laurie says prices have been strong since November, with the Chinese construction sector particularly busy, but he warns that freight prices jumped by 20% in March, so the returns to New Zealand log producers will fall. A man arrested soon after the Dunedin City Council's Civic Centre was vandalised will appear in court on several charges tomorrow. A man wielding a baseball bat smashed windows and computers in the building. The police say officers were already searching for him, claiming he had made online threats. Another central city business was also damaged during the rampage. The leader of Tauranga City Council's team of commissioners is shocked about the state of the city's community facilities. Former National MP and Cabinet Minister Anne Tolley says they are the worst she's seen in her 3 decades of governance. The commission was put in place due to a dysfunctional council. Those are the latest news headlines on RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. Kia ora anō, ko Lisa Owen Takuingwa, and this is Checkpoint. It is time for the business news right now, and Nona Peltios joined me in the studio. Nona, you've got some news on small businesses. Well, this is in the wake of last month's sort of snap lockdown. They seem to have come through with not so much damage?
Well, yes. So other than Auckland, which had the lockdowns, couple of lockdowns in February, the rest of the country is looking pretty good with small businesses reporting pretty good earnings and so on. So overall, revenue grew 1.5% for the total. And that was really quite a lot dragged down by the hospitality sector, for example. We saw the drag there at a drop of 14%. Now, regionally, Queenstown as well, their business revenue was down 20%. So overall, that has had a significant drag on the overall total. But if you excluded that, overall, it's a pretty good picture for small business. Job growth as well, very positive. But again, hospitality sector is lagging there, as well as Auckland, where we've seen those lockdowns. So it is that is continuing to have an effect on the economy. But hey, there's an upside to everything, right?
Let's look at this next story, which is quite curious. Half of the country's used tyres are going to be burned for fuel. Now, who's doing this and fuel for what?
Well, it's fuel for cement So a lot of people don't realize, but concrete is one of the world's largest emissions. It accounts for about 8% of the carbon emissions globally. And so cement companies for years have been trying very hard to reduce the emissions. You need very hot energy to create concrete. And coal has been one of the things that we've been using here in New Zealand. So Fletcher Building has been working for some time to convert that to tires. So I was surprised. I don't have a car, so of course it is a bit of a surprise. But 6 million tires go into the landfills or are stockpiled every year in New Zealand. 6 million. Well, they're going to take 3 million of those and they're going to burn them at a very high temperature. So they basically combust and become a lot less damaging to the environment, but achieve some of the outcomes that they need to produce cement. And New Zealand's concrete, believe it or not, produces about 20% less emissions than that's imported to New Zealand at the moment. And Fletcher Building's goal is to reduce overall emissions 30% by 2030. And the project cost, $25 million to get up and started, and the government contributed $16 million towards that. So there you go. And so that's a pretty positive story, I guess.
Really interesting. And what numbers have you got from the market today, Nana?
Interesting. The market was a bit mixed in Asia, and that was because we had a couple of big investment banks announce that they were up for some big losses after a big U.S. hedge fund. Basically, they were forced to liquidate some billions of dollars of assets. So that did send a shockwave through the market. But New Zealand's market wasn't very much affected at all. In fact, we ended up nearly 2/3% today. That's the NZX Top 50 Index by 79 points to 12,447. And our dollar is trading at 70.3 US cents, 91.8 cents Australian, and 51.1 pence.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with our business news there. The head of MIQ has made more changes to the exercise bus system after a series of failures on board buses from the Grand Mercure Hotel. Frustrated public health experts have been calling on the government for tighter restrictions at the border and MIQ facilities. Since July last year, there have been 13 border control failings, one of which resulted in a cluster of 179 cases. Charlotte Cook reports.
Earlier this week, the number of border failures notched up to 13 in 9 months. Returnees on an exercise bus mingled between bubbles, had no face masks on, and had people from low and high-risk countries switching seats. Late this afternoon, the head of MIQ revealed changes have been made. Brigadier Jim Bliss says they'll now be using two-door buses. The driver will use the front door and returnees will enter and exit from the back. As well as that, there'll now be a verbal briefing at the beginning of each journey about wearing masks correctly at all times and sitting in the same seat to and from the exercise area. Hard plastic screens are now in place behind the driver's seat to separate them from the returnees, and they'll have to wear N95 masks. A group of experts have been calling on the government to tighten restrictions for months. Public health professor Nick Wilson says enough is enough.
We can see from a public health perspective that it is possible to do things very much better. But what we're seeing here is potentially some complacency by the government. It's done a great job with vaccinating border workers, but it's not thinking about all the other problems seriously enough. And that's why we continue to have problems.
There are 2 new cases at the border today, both from the same flight as 10 others who tested positive on Monday. Professor Nick Wilson says that suggests the pre-departure testing system is not working, and red zone countries should be suspended from entering while allegations about fake negative results are investigated. He reckons the government should prioritise a bubble with Australia over the risk posed by COVID-riddled countries.
The economic benefits of an effective trans-Tasman green zone are very large. It might be a reasonable trade-off to focus on that successful arrangement and turn down the tap of all these infected people coming in. The risks are enormously great with one group of countries and very low with Australia. So it seems like we've got the balance wrong.
National's COVID-19 spokesperson Chris Bishop says restrictions for high-risk returnees need to be escalated.
don't think they should stop people from high-risk countries coming in, but the protocols around those passengers need to be better. And we've been saying for some months now that there should be dedicated hotels for high-risk passengers. That hasn't happened. And instead, we still hear stories of mixing and mingling on things like exercise buses in the common areas of the hotels.
He can't believe exercise bus trips are being allowed to resume. Nick Wilson says small changes could make a big difference to the country's risk.
To reduce the number of infected people coming from high-risk red zone countries, we need to look at vaccinating people potentially when they arrive in New Zealand. We need to look at moving MIQ facilities out of cities, exercise areas and smoking areas. They need to be removed.
He says daily saliva testing of border staff and returnees is another good option, and the cost of implementing the changes is worth the investment. The February outbreak was most likely linked to the border and heavily impacted the South Auckland community. It's hoped vaccinations of border and MIQ workers will lessen the chance of a border breach. So far, more than 40,000 have had their first jab. As the next phase of the rollout begins, the director of the Immunisation Advisory Centre, Nikki Turner, says she'd like to see an increase in targeted messaging about vaccinations to vulnerable communities.
So what I'd like to see the New Zealand government do is to really ramp up the communication, the science, the messages to all our different communities, particularly those who've traditionally missed out. So I really want to see that our Māori communities, our Pasifika communities, elderly, rest home, residential care, really get to hear the messages.
She says it should be focusing on groups of people rather than meeting a vaccination or herd immunity percentage. For Checkpoint, Charlotte Cook.
The government's hoping to boost the number of Māori and Pasifika midwives in the country. At the moment, less than 10% of midwives identify as Māori and less than 3% as Pasifika. A new $6 million initiative will see New Zealand's 5 midwifery education providers work together to increase the number of Māori and Pasifika students. RNZ Pacific's Sally Jane Hopgood reports.
Auckland Pasifika mum Angeline Kalolo is pleased the shortage of Māori and Pasifika midwives is being addressed.
There's so many PI and Māori women who are in need of this type of care, and who better to care for them than their own people. There'll be that connection of cultural values as well as that friendly face, that familiar face.
She reckons having more Māori and Pasifika midwives will help break down cultural barriers.
Just having that cultural barrier that you have of certain protocols and beliefs that I have as a Pacific person in caring for my baby, I would feel that midwife would truly understand in ways that I don't have to go over and above to explain to her, or even feel shame to explain to her.
Right now, there's only a handful of Māori and Pasifika midwives. That's despite a 20% of Aotearoa's birthing population identifying as Māori and 10% as Pasifika. The new government initiative hopes to change that. The Ministry of Health's providing $6 million funding over the next 4 years to help recruit and retain Māori and Pasifika undergraduate midwifery students. Teresa Krishnan's a Māori liaison and clinical educator in midwifery at AET. They're aiming to triple the number of Māori and quadruple the number of Pasifika undergraduate midwifery students. Her comments been voiced.
My aim is that year on year for the next 5 years, we see those numbers increase. We will then see them through to a successful graduation. This funding enables us to continue our mahi to achieve those outcomes.
She says a nationwide recruitment drive for prospective students will run from April to December.
We want Māori and Pasifika thinking about a midwifery career to know they will be supported in their study to graduate and to go on to a deeply rewarding career that makes an overwhelming positive difference to whānau, communities and Aotearoa as a whole.
AUT's National Pacific League, Ngā Te Paeru Masters, says each midwifery school will develop their own strategy. She believes Pasifika mothers having Pasifika midwives could help address mental health issues they face.
That understanding of where they're coming from, and also, all the family dynamics, and being really aware of that, and also having someone who you can trust, you can talk to, providing a safe space for that to happen is absolutely essential.
The College of Midwives President Nicole Pihema says it's important to have appropriate cultural clinicians and midwives.
But we really know that what we are getting with those Māori midwives that are currently working with their communities is that their outcomes are far surpassing those of their non-Māori counterparts.
Auckland University of Technology holds the contract with the Ministry of Health and will have agreements with the other 4 education providers. Ko Salajen Hop, good tēnei.
Tauranga residents are being warned the area will pay in other ways if it doesn't invest in infrastructure. The city's 4 commissioners are working through its upcoming long-term plan after taking over the dysfunctional council earlier this year. This morning they fronted for business leaders during a hui facilitated by the Tauranga Chamber of Commerce. Jean Bauer was there.
It's a city of 150,000 people. It's the fastest growing city in New Zealand. It has the biggest port in New Zealand. But it isn't actually acting like a city of that size, of that importance.
That's former National MP Anne Tolley describing her new charge, Tauranga. In February, she and 3 other commissioners were tasked with nursing the beleaguered city back to health after infighting and dysfunction among elected members. The commission chair is shocked by the lack of investment in the city.
In my 30 years in politics, I don't think I've ever seen a community that has been so poorly served for the people who live here with their community facilities. I could not believe the lack of investment.
The commissioners are currently working on the city's long-term plan. Mrs Tolley told business leaders it'll seek to catch up on past underinvestment in soft infrastructure like parks. It'll also pave the way for future growth.
Expensive roads and pipes and infrastructure that's needed to facilitate growth and support growth. Because no matter what happens, this city will continue to grow.
Tauranga ratepayers are facing a proposed 12% rates increase. Commissioner and infrastructure expert Stephen Selwood says no one wants to pay more rates.
But the reality is that if we don't invest in our city, we fail our businesses, we fail our families and we fail our communities. Because the city is the platform upon which we can enjoy life. We pay in other ways if we don't invest.
And there's a long list of needs.
We don't have the community facilities we want. Our transport system is clogged. We don't have adequate public transport services. We're polluting our rivers with unsatisfactory water treatment. Or we're not drinking the best water that we need to have to be healthy. And all of those issues are costs that we pay in another way.
Commissioner Shad Rolleston says the council needs support to tackle some of its pressing issues, like a lack of land for housing and commercial development.
And we also need the support of the business sector. We need the support of tangata whenua in order to make these things work and make these long-term decisions.
That's echoed by Commissioner Bill Wasley.
And having that view that working together actually is where the success will be.
A business leader asked the commissioners what's to stop another dysfunctional and inexperienced council being elected once they hand back the reins in October 2022. And Tolley says that's why this long-term plan is important.
Much of the planning that we're putting in place won't actually start on the ground for another couple of years, but they should be advanced enough that you wouldn't be able to stop the big infrastructure projects and some of the community facility projects.
But the commissioners are all too aware their job is temporary.
But it does weigh heavily on our minds that we have a very short period of time in which to bring about some quite major changes.
I Tauranga, te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Jean Bauer tēnei.
It's 12 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. After 6 tonight, the Workplace Safety Minister demands accountability from Auckland Port bosses following a damning safety review. Hit the brakes, a road safety trial in an Auckland suburbs driving some people around the bend. In the low traffic project, plywood boxes have blocked streets to stop vehicles getting through. Some love it, but several drivers have taken to the footpath to get past. Our reporter Matthew Hutching and cameraman Nick Monroe have the story.
It's the morning rush hour in Onehunga, but birds can be heard singing as parents and children walk and ride to school. Just a few blocks away, cars are bumper to bumper. Normally Arthur Street would be the same. It usually sees about 5,000 vehicles a day. But now, a blockade of big plywood boxes has turned the rat run into a cul-de-sac.
They've already been beaten up, cars have already been pushing them around, they're over 200 kilos each.
people, for some reason, are driving on the footpath to get around these blockages.
Came out of the blue, but fantastic. People are getting used to it already. Of course there's some aggro people, banging into boxes, etc.
To drive now, we've got to get onto main road, so what used to be a 2-minute journey is now 12 to 15 minutes.
I'm walking down the middle of a very quiet street in Onehunga. Normally, this would be a busy rat run of traffic trying to get through to avoid the main roads. But since the boxes went in, that number has drastically reduced.
It's called the Arthur and Grey Street Low Traffic Area. Maunga Kia Tāmaki Local Board member Peter McGlashan says it's about making streets safer and cutting down our car dependency.
It's 6 to 8 weeks of testing some things out, gathering public feedback, truly open consultation process where the people can actually see the plans in real life rather than just on theory on a computer screen or on paper. And then off the back of that, a decision will be made as to whether or not how much of it is kept, how much of it is discarded, whether it's all discarded or whether it's all kept, with a pathway to permanence where these can potentially be a way of shifting the way that Aucklanders move around the city.
But the response has been fraught.
General overall consensus of the community is that we all want safer streets. And the main frustration at the moment is the lack of community consult. There was minimal consult by AT, and there was minimal consult by the local board.
That's Heather Bates. She lives just outside the low traffic area and says the boxes have made the main roads even more congested, more than doubling her driving time. The criticism she's seen from the community is mostly about a lack of consultation before the project started. Tara Taff owns the School of Fish Childcare Centre on Grey Street. She says it's stressful for parents dropping off their children on their way to work.
Our families are largely local, and so the feedback that I'm getting is that they had no idea also, and so they were met with that as, I'm sure you can imagine, a challenge in the morning getting to work, dropping children off, and then asking me if I was aware of it, and I would have liked to have given them some notification that this was going to be happening.
On the street, local parents Sarah and John have welcomed the project, but agree the messaging could have been clearer.
Controversial in this area, but we actually really love it, yeah.
I mean, prior to them being in, you do get a lot of traffic backing up, so it'd be the same kind of traffic that you'd see on Church Street and Mount Smart. And because the roads aren't really designed for that, people's mirrors are always getting smashed off.
John says a clear website could have helped quell the frustration that's been seen online.
But in the absence of any really good information, people made up their own information. The mob got, fired up, and now the mob is going to be pretty hard to settle down, and in fact, they may have missed the boat.
But low traffic neighbourhoods have been successful overseas as people try other ways to travel. One low traffic area in London has seen a 40% drop in car ownership over the last 5 years. Peter McGlashan hopes in Onehunga some short-term pain will bring long-term gain.
We've spoken to dozens of parents who drive 600 metres every morning to drop their kids off, and now that this intersection is safe, they've said actually my 6-year-old and 10-year-old are walking to school themselves now. That's 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 cars off the road just within this local area. So that's what we know is happening globally when these things are left down for long enough. People start to work out another way to get around, and we're just really hopeful that the community can be patient enough to see those changes come to life.
He says it's a short trial. It was in the community news from September last year. They've had public workshops and done letterbox drops.
But the reality is, until you put a box in the middle of the road in front of them, that they wouldn't have noticed it.
And it's come at an interesting time. Last week, the Helen Clark Foundation told the Climate Change Commission that low traffic neighbourhoods are an effective and low-cost way to cut carbon emissions. But with one of the highest rates of car ownership in the OECD, it could be a tough road for us to curb the habit. For Checkpoint, Matthew Hutching.
Now, if you were listening to that story from Matthew and Nick Munro, go online. You can see the video there and you get a clear picture of what those plywood barricades look like. And we'd love your feedback on that, whether you could ditch the car if your street suddenly turned into a cul-de-sac too. Text us on 2101. A West Auckland man who ignored Kauri dieback rules has been found guilty of breaking the law when he went onto a track that had been closed to stop the spread of the tree-killing disease. Robert Armistead was caught several times on camera in 2019, entering closed walkways in the Waitakere Ranges in Tauranga. He pleaded guilty to one charge and Judge Tremewan found him guilty of 2 others. He will be sentenced in May. Well, joining me now is Rachel Callagher, General Manager, Environmental Services for Auckland Council. Hi, Rachel. What was this guy's excuse?
Good evening, Lisa. Well, look, the excuse was, I think, at the end of the day, one where there was an argument that the area he was in was not parkland when it absolutely was.
And so how often was he doing this and how did he get caught out?
Well, the charges that were heard today and the outcome of a guilty result came about as the result of 3 times being found inside a closed area in the Waitakere Ranges Regional Park.
So is that a ranger coming across him, or...?
We have an active compliance program, so and the compliance staff are focused on areas that are closed to the public, and it was during our routine compliance work that Mr. Armitage was found and spoken to on more than one occasion.
So what were the potential consequences of this? So people understand how serious it is. These tracks are closed, obviously to stop the spread of Kauri dieback. I mean, how serious is it when people buck the rules and go wandering on these trails?
Well, look, what I want to say is that, we do not want to be taking these types of prosecutions. Our preference is that people actually do the right thing. And what we do see is that most people are absolutely playing their part in helping us protect our magnificent Kauri forest. But in situations like this, where we've got an individual that, despite the warnings, continued to access a closed area and showed no regard for the damage that they could cause, then we want to hold them to account. And, this court process was the end result of that.
How many others are there that are breaking the rules? You issue warnings, I understand. How many of those have you handed out?
Well, we've had a number of different warnings and trespass notices issued. So we've had 139 individuals issued trespass notices since compliance teams were established in April 2019. And like I say, we have trespass notices, we have warning notices. We tend to start with an education approach in the first instance, but if we find people going into areas more than once, then things start to ramp up.
How much of the Waitakere Ranges is still off limits because of Kauri dieback?
Well, back in 2018, a decision was made to close the forested area of the Waitakere Ranges Regional Parkland. At that time, 36 tracks remained open and 115 tracks were closed. And since 2018, we've reopened 21 tracks, which equates to about 33 kilometres of track reopened.
Yeah, so it is still a major and critical issue at the moment. I mean, what happens from here?
Well, we're continuing our efforts to upgrade and reopen tracks so that we've got a good provision of recreational opportunities for the public. We know that people want to get out there and enjoy the Waitakere Ranges and other sites with Kauri trees. So that work continues, and along with that, we will be continuing our compliance efforts to make sure that people are staying out of those closed areas.
So in terms of compliance then, what part do you think this prosecution plays?
Look, I think it sends a really important message to people that might be considering going into an area that's not open to the public to really reconsider that and stick to the tracks that are open. Those tracks have been upgraded. They are safe for people to use and enjoy, and we really want people doing the right thing and helping us tackle this terrible disease that's out there and making sure that our future generations can enjoy the forest that we get to.
Are your rangers encountering any aggro over that, the closed tracks?
Well, look, certainly at times we do have people that are frustrated about not being able to get into areas that they would like to. But again, we really request that people, there are lots of tracks out there that are open and available to people. We've got, well over 50 tracks, close to 60 tracks that are out there and that people can use. And we really encourage them to perhaps try something different and see what else there is to offer.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us. That's Rachel Callagher, who's the General Manager, Environmental Services for Auckland Council. A lot of you are getting in touch about the Ports of Auckland, so let's get to some of your feedback. This person says a number of people working at Ports of Auckland lose their life. Tony Gibson loses his job. If that happened, I'd say he got off lightly compared to the people working under him. If he is, as CEO, truly didn't know about the health and safety issues, then he's incompetent and should lose his job on that basis. Take responsibility for the deaths under your watch, Tony. Step up and step down, that listener says. Frank's got in touch to say Tony Gibson said he didn't know what was going on, ? For that reason alone, he should resign immediately. The man is not fit to be CEO. Neil's got in touch to say management and board at Ports of Auckland need to go. It is a joke for the CEO to resolve to stay on long enough to fix the problems that he has freely admitted he didn't know about. Gary says there must be compulsory leadership education for all employees as to how to treat people well in the workplace.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. The brother of a Ports of Auckland worker who died on the job is calling for the resignation of the company's chief executive. A scathing review of health and safety failings at the ports released today says the company needs to prioritise safety over productivity and profitability. Tua Dyer, whose brother Laboom was killed in a straddle carrier accident in 2018, says Tony Gibson must step down so the problems can be fixed.
It's his fault, everything's like that anyway. I mean, he's supposed to be the man in charge, and why is he not hiring extra safety people to come and investigate the ports and make changes?
Tua Dyer says he has friends who still work at Ports of Auckland and he fears for their safety if Tony Gibson isn't able to make the necessary changes. A lawyer is calling for an investigation into an alleged human trafficking ring following the arrest of 9 Chinese nationals. The men were arrested for working illegally at Auckland building sites and are awaiting deportation. Immigration New Zealand says none had work visas and some had overstayed for more than 3 years. But their lawyer, Matt Robson, says the men are trafficked workers and victims of exploitation.
They're paid money to agents to bring them for the purpose of working here. They don't speak English, they don't know the law. They just put that fate in hands of these people. We have declared law, international commitments to end trafficking. And if people are trafficked, they're then supposed to be assisted, not shoved into jail.
Immigration New Zealand says it won't comment while the investigation is ongoing. Unions and healthcare groups are worried firms are not taking up the government's offer to help cover the cost when staff need to self-isolate after a COVID-19 test and can't work from home. Just over 6,000 applications for the short-term absence payment have been approved over a period when 230,000 COVID tests were done. Here's our social issues reporter Sarah Robson.
The one-off $350 payment has been available for almost 2 months. Tali Williams from First Union is concerned employers are still asking people to take unpaid leave when they are waiting for their COVID test results, and employees don't know about the payment. Anna Rogers from South Seas Healthcare says it's crucial for people on low incomes who might otherwise feel pressured to go to work. Ko Sarah Robson, aho.
An Auckland man has been found guilty of murdering Denver Chance by shooting him 3 times in the head. Mr Chance went missing in 2019 after telling his flatmates in Mairangi Bay that he was going out and would be back soon. His body was found in a freezer 2 weeks later at a property in Kingseat. During a 3-week trial in the High Court at Auckland, J. Christopher Lingman unsuccessfully argued he had killed Mr Chance in self-defence. Lingman will be sentenced in June. A man arrested soon after the Dunedin City Council's Civic Centre was vandalised this morning will appear in court on several charges tomorrow. A man wielding a baseball bat smashed windows and computers in the building. The police say officers were already searching for the man they arrested after he made online threats. Another central city business was also damaged during the rampage. The council's Customer Services Centre was closed for the rest of the day and will be reopened at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. 2 people have been arrested after an assault and 2 robberies in Auckland today. The police received reports of an aggravated robbery at a dairy in New Windsor at around midday, and then of an assault at a nearby superette. They say the robbers left at speed in a stolen vehicle, often driving on the wrong side of the road. Road spikes stopped the vehicle from getting onto the southwestern motorway at the Walmsley Road on-ramp. It's coming up to 4 minutes past 6. The White Ferns have beaten Australia on the last ball of their T20 game in Napier in a nail-biting finish to the second game of the series a few minutes ago. Maddie Green struck a boundary to give New Zealand a 4-wicket win. Batting first, Australia had made 129 for 4. The win keeps the series alive at 1-1 for the decider in Auckland on Thursday. New Zealand Rugby accepts that top players will need to sign off on a proposed $465 million investment deal with a US tech giant for it to succeed. The proposal is for Silver Lake to take a 15% stake in New Zealand Rugby's commercial rights. A group of senior All Blacks and Black Ferns, via the Players Association, wrote to New Zealand Rugby in January outlining their concerns. NZR Chief Executive Mark Robinson says he has spoken with the players involved and will meet with the association's head Rob Nichol tomorrow. He says they won't push forward without the players' support.
We appreciate Rob's views. He's been very public about those. We're looking forward to the opportunity of sitting, behind closed doors in coming days and talking through some of those concerns. We believe we've provided a lot of information to help him understand the overall state of the game in this country, as well as the overall potential benefits that bringing a partner in can bring.
And in other cricket news, England fast bowler Jofra Archer has had to have surgery for the removal of a fragment of glass from a tendon in his right hand after he dropped a fish tank while cleaning it. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights, Tony Stamp samples a bit of Christian rock and some 70s Nigerian funk. We're back at last year's Word Christchurch Writers' Festival for a discussion on men's mental health and a couple of blokes who've written about it. Our mainly Marxist political historian Brian Roper charts the decline and fall of the American empire, while the BBC wonders if anyone can fix it. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland and Auckland, outbreaks of rain, heavy and possibly thundery with possible downpours at times, especially north of Auckland. Clearing to isolated showers tomorrow afternoon. Coromandel to Manawatu, including Bay of Plenty, Central High Country and Wairarapa. Periods of rain, heavy at times with possible thunderstorms and downpours. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, a few showers, more frequent tomorrow. Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough. Periods of rain, some heavy falls tonight and again tomorrow night. Possible thunder. Canterbury, cloudy with patchy drizzle, turning to rain inland tomorrow afternoon. Otago and Southland, cloud and some patchy rain developing tonight. Fine spells and the odd shower tomorrow. Bulla, Westland and Fiordland mainly fine. A few inland showers clearing tonight, but late rain tomorrow for Bulla, possibly thundery. And Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional rain. RNZ National. It's 7 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just joining us, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's not credible Auckland port bosses were oblivious to the extent of safety problems at the company, according to the Workplace Minister. An independent report has found systemic failings at the company and calls for it to put safety ahead of profits. Ports of Auckland has been linked to 3 deaths in 3 years. The report, ordered in the wake of those fatalities, highlights potential under-reporting of accidents, with some workers fearing a backlash for speaking up. It makes 45 recommendations, including mending relationships with the Maritime Union, allowing the board to speak directly and freely to workers, and introducing safety performance targets. Workplace Safety Minister Michael Wood says the report is grim reading.
This is a deeply concerning report, Lisa. And there were 2 key lines or descriptions in the report that stood out to me and really described the problem here. The first is that the report says that there are, quote, systemic problems in relation to critical health and safety, risk management and organised culture. So in other words, we're not dealing with isolated incidents or issues, we're dealing with embedded issues around health and safety at a safety critical work site. And the other one that stood out to me was effectively a requirement or a recommendation in the report that the port needs to prioritise safety over productivity and profitability, which is a clear implication that has not been happening to date. That is clearly unacceptable. This has to change, and I expect that all of the recommendations of this independent report are taken up.
The fact that the port needs to be told to put safety before profits, what does that tell you about the culture that they have operated under?
Well, it tells me that there's a culture in place which hasn't valued human life and well-being, as it should. And we've seen the tragic result of that in multiple workplace fatalities and serious injuries at this port. There has been discussion about this for a number of years. We've now had one prosecution in the court, another one underway. This has to change. In this country, we've just gone through a year where we've come through a global pandemic because we've cared about each other. We need to do that on our work sites as well to ensure that everyone gets home safe and in one piece. And I absolutely expect the management and governance of the Ports of Auckland to take on board this direction from this report.
So who's responsible for that then? Right? So the families of 3 people who have died, they live with that forever now. But who's taking responsibility and what should that look like? Does someone need to go?
I expect that the Board of Ports of Auckland take this report in its totality. There has to be accountability for what has happened, and these recommendations need to be accepted. It would be absolutely inexcusable for families and individuals having gone through that pain and having had this report come through from some of the most respected health and safety people in the country for it not to be acted upon. Now, the reality in terms of the employment of individuals at the Ports of Auckland is that has to be something that is a matter for the Board of the Ports of Auckland, but there needs to be accountability and there needs to be action. The one other thing I'll say is that I'm really pleased that we've got this report, and that was at the instigation of Auckland Council, who are the ultimate owner. So that was a very, very positive step. The board and the management now need to take responsibility.
What confidence do you have in these changes being made? Because here's the thing, the people who are leading these changes are the people who were presiding over this organisation when it got itself into this dire situation.
Well, look, the ultimate owner of Ports of Auckland is Auckland Council. And one of the points that I've made consistently when I've talked about this is that the port needs to think of itself less as a private company operating in some sort of bubble off to itself, and it needs to think of itself as being accountable back to the people of Auckland and its ultimate owner. I've had a number of discussions with Mayor Goff, including this morning after we both read the report, and I'm very pleased that he, on behalf of the people of Auckland and the Council of Auckland, who are the owner, has a rock-solid expectation that that this report and the recommendations within it are fully implemented. That is the best thing that we can do to honour the legacy of those people who have sadly lost their lives and been harmed.
As Minister, what can you do to hold these people responsible and to account?
Well, I think there are 2 things broadly that I can do. The first is to very clearly and very publicly make my expectations clear, which is that things have to change and these recommendations have to be implemented. I'm doing that now and I'll continue doing it. The second thing that I can do is to make sure that the agency, WorkSafe, or our health and safety regulator, who I have responsibility for, are engaged in making sure that at this port and other ports around the country, we have a strong health and safety culture. WorkSafe have responded to this report and identified that they're going to be proactively working with Ports of Auckland to make sure that we address the issues that are contained within the report.
Can the port improve under this leadership?
If I was a part of the leadership of Ports of Auckland, I would be taking a long, hard look at myself. I would be absorbing this report in its totality. And frankly, if the leadership of the Ports of Auckland is not prepared to recognise that what has happened is unacceptable and to make changes, then in my view they shouldn't continue in their roles.
Did you hear Tony Gibson say this morning that he was shocked to hear the contents of the report and that workers felt unsafe and couldn't report their concerns? Is that credible?
Well, look, this has been a concern which has been raised for some time, that people haven't felt safe to speak up. That is highlighted in the report. That sometimes is an issue in workplaces, but if you're going to build a strong health and safety culture, particularly in a health and safety critical environment like a port, it is an absolute priority that people feel safe to bring forward concerns, that people feel safe to say, no, this work is not safe, that people feel safe to say, hey, the system which incentivises productivity over and above safety isn't right and we need to do something about it. That is highlighted boldly in this report. It has been raised before. I don't think it's credible for the port to say that they weren't aware of this issue. The onus now needs to be on them to build up a culture with their workforce, to build some trust and to build some confidence with that workforce that it is okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it is expected and wanted that people come forward and identify their concerns.
When you say if the leadership is unable to deliver on this, they should go, how long do they get, do you think, to prove whether they're committed to this and can do it?
Well, look, their board will need to determine that, but I would expect in the very short term for a full acceptance of these recommendations, a full plan for implementation, and evidence of a total commitment to prioritise this piece of work. As we've covered, the report says that there are priorities which are wrong here, productivity and profit being put ahead of safety and human life. They need to come out, recognise that, and put in place the steps to actually implement that focus. And any companies that are out there that are putting profit and productivity ahead of human life and well-being need to reflect on why they're doing what they do. Because if I was one of those people, I'd want to be able to not just look at my balance sheet at the end of the day, but to be able to sleep comfortably at night.
And that was Workplace Safety Minister Michael Wood. Now, Checkpoint has made repeated attempts today to reach Ports of Auckland CEO Tony Gibson and the board chair asking for an interview. We haven't heard back from either of them. It is almost 15 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. New Zealand Rugby boss Mark Robinson is optimistic a massive $460 million deal for rugby will go ahead. Robinson spoke to media today about what he called a transformational deal in which US investment firm Silver Lake would buy 15% in New Zealand rugby. But some of the country's leading players have signed a letter threatening to block the deal. Now, a mediator has been called in to resolve the standoff. Rugby reporter Joe Porter has more.
The letter is signed by David Kirk, the 1987 All Blacks World Cup winning captain, the New Zealand Players Association Chief Executive Rob Nichol, and All Blacks Sam Cane, Sam Whitelock, Aaron Smith and Dane Coles, and Black Ferns Sarah Hedini and Salika Winiata. New Zealand Rugby Chief Executive Mark Robinson says the letter was signed 2 months ago and he's since spoken to the players involved.
What I'm hearing is that it was at a time and place some time ago now, and things have changed markedly in terms of the amount of information available to consider before ultimately making a decision on this. So what it says to me is that per those conversations, they remain very open-minded.
The Players Association boss, Rob Nichol, has said they'll block the sale if they can't agree to terms with New Zealand Rugby. Robinson is confident they can resolve their issues and says NZR won't push forward without the players' support. He says he plans to speak with key stakeholders, including the Players Association, tomorrow.
We appreciate Rob's views, and he has those he's been very public about those. We're looking forward to the opportunity of sitting, behind closed doors in coming days and talking through some of those concerns.
A big part of the players' concerns centre around how a largely Anglo-American US investment company might misappropriate or misuse the Pasifika culture and tikanga Māori that's part of the All Blacks fabric. Robinson says there are plans in place to stop that from happening.
We believe we've given due care and consideration around all the potential risks, controls and enhancement around cultural consideration here. So that is not to say we've got a foolproof master plan. It's like all these other areas I just talked about. We're continuing to receive feedback as to how that might be reflected in any partnership going forward.
Robinson says New Zealand Rugby needs money. He says their cash reserves were eaten into by the COVID pandemic and their current financial model isn't sustainable. He believes the Silver Lake deal is the answer.
We need to think really long and hard if we want the game to be the way it's always been in terms of its place in New Zealand rugby history, and New Zealand history, that we will have to reposition the game and reposition the way we approach it. We cannot continue doing things exactly the same way as we have over the last 130 years. As great as our legacy has been, there's going to be a need to have to change some of the ways we operate.
Next month, the 26 provincial unions are set to vote on the deal, with New Zealand Rugby needing a 50.01% vote in favour of the proposal. They also need approval from the Players Association. If the deal gets done, and Robinson believes it will be announced at NZR's next annual general meeting on April the 29th. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Joe Porter aho.
The country's first hydrogen-fuelled bus has been unveiled today as Auckland Transport moves towards an emissions-free fleet by 2040. The $1.1 million bus will run from Botany to Britomart for a trial running over the next 2 years. Reporter Louise Tenuth and camera operator Simon Rogers went to check it out.
1, 2, 3. And the first hydrogen bus in New Zealand launched.
The first hydrogen bus here at the Ports of Auckland, where it'll refuel at a station in the port's yard. Hydrogen generates electricity to run the bus along with batteries, leaving behind just 3 byproducts: water, electricity and heat. It's part of Auckland Transport's big plan to replace the Supercity's existing diesel buses with electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles at a cost of between $150 to $200 million. With vehicles making up nearly 50% of the city's emissions, Minister of Transport Michael Wood is thrilled to be progressing on climate change goals.
Last year in our Parliament, our Prime Minister stood and declared a climate emergency. It was a statement of serious intent that New Zealand is prepared to play its role in tackling the great challenge of our time. And also I'm very pleased that we have been able to announce support to work with local government partners to shift our public transport fleet to a zero carbon basis by 2035.
Mayor Phil Goff echoing the aim to make Tamaki Makaurau a more carbon neutral city.
A few years ago I was in Paris and I committed us not to purchasing diesel-powered buses or any carbon-powered buses after 2025. In a few short years, I can now say that we won't be doing any purchase of those buses from this year. That is part of the commitment of Auckland Council and Auckland Transport.
He says the hydrogen bus trial will determine what Auckland's buses run on in the future, with 2 other fleets of electric buses already running since last year.
We know less about hydrogen buses, but this is a chance for us to trial this bus and see what it's capable of doing.
CEO of Ports of Auckland, Tony Gibson, says the refuelling station isn't just limited to buses.
What we will do is build the electrolysis machine on the wharf and also position those in our freight hubs around New Zealand to service trucks, rail if necessary, and of course the last mile with trucks.
Auckland Transport CEO Shane Allison says over the next few years they'll be closely monitoring how things go.
Things that are really important are how do customers feel about it. We think Aucklanders will be really pleased to see us taking leadership role in terms of climate change. So customers, we want to make sure that it operates as safely as we're pretty sure it can. And we want to see that it gives us the operational flexibility we need.
And the hydrogen fuel cell technology will allow buses to travel further than fully electric vehicles.
Oh, look, we're expecting to get a full day, at least a full day of operation without having to go back and get topped up or do other things.
Plans could also be on the way for another hydrogen fuelling facility, with Taranaki base Hiringa Energy Limited set to build in South Auckland. Mō te hōtaka o te ahi, ko Louise Tenuth aho.
And if you want to check that bus out, we'll put Simon and Louise's story on our Facebook page. Easter and school holiday plans are in upheaval in Greater Brisbane as millions of people begin a snap 3-day lockdown. There are at least 7 community cases of the highly infectious UK COVID strain. Some states have reintroduced tough border restrictions and international arrivals into Queensland have been halved. The ABC's Annie Guest reports.
The next Kipper Ring train will depart
from supermarkets to cafes, breweries, a hardware store and a busy train line in Brisbane's north. There's a long list of places visited by Queensland's latest COVID cases. At the Launton railway station, 55-year-old Malcolm Stigler was returning home to Bribie Island as Greater Brisbane began 3 days of lockdown.
You know, I think everyone should be doing what the government says, and that this concerns me. We've been pretty lucky so far, but you've only got to look at other countries. We don't want to go that way, you know what I mean? Yeah.
You said you're unemployed. Was that because of COVID?
Yes, I got laid off this time last year because of COVID, yeah.
What were you doing?
Slaughtering. been very hard. Been a tough year. A lot of people have done a lot tougher than me, but, we don't want to see it go back to the way it was 12 months ago.
Schools and gyms are closed. It's back to working from home. Hospitality venues are takeaway only, and masks are mandatory throughout the state.
Just a Pinot Gris for you, Sarah?
A Pinot Gris for me, thank you.
Around the corner from the train station, AM caught up with cafe and bar owner Graham Scott as he served last drinks before the lockdown. He employs 17 people, almost all of whom will lose 3 days' pay.
Financially, it's another hit. And emotionally, it's difficult, but, we'll get over that part. Yeah, Wednesday night we had a function here pre-booked for our maximum numbers, and that's obviously been cancelled. Part of what annoys me is that people can't come here for a drink and socialise, even socially distanced, but they can go down and buy their landscaping products, which I can't see how that's essential. But anyway, I think we're all essential. We should all be shut down.
Had you recovered from last year's hit?
No, definitely not. I'm still 30+% down on sales.
University of Queensland epidemiologist Dr Linda Selvey believes the restrictions are the right balance.
And that was Annie Guest from the ABC reporting. There's tight security in place for the trial of former police officer Derek Chauvin, accused of the murder of black man George Floyd. Mr Chauvin denies murdering the unarmed black suspect by placing his knee on Mr Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, although prosecutors say there was no excuse for the former officer's conduct. Our correspondent Simon Marks reports.
The first day of the trial moved at a rapid clip, opening statements from both the prosecution and defence teams, and then evidence from 3 separate witnesses to George Floyd's killing. But the trial began with drama, prosecutors showing the entire 9.5-minute video that sparked protests worldwide.
My stomach hurts, my neck hurts, everything hurts. I can't breathe all the time.
Officer Chauvin not releasing his knee from Mr Floyd's neck, even as onlookers pointed out that Mr Floyd had passed out.
You gonna just sit there with your knee on his neck, bro? You're a real man for that, bro.
That thing you guys aren't checking his pulse and doing compressions if he needs that. You guys are on another level. Oh my God, bro.
Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell told the jury the case against Derek Chauvin is open and shut.
Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge when he used excessive and unreasonable force upon the body of Mr. George Floyd.
But defence lawyers say there's more to this trial than one piece of cell phone video. They point to 400 witnesses questioned by investigators. And defence attorney Eric Nelson made it clear he wants the case to focus on Mr. Floyd's conduct, not Derek Chauvin's.
The evidence will show that when confronted by police, Mr. Floyd put drugs in his mouth in an effort to conceal them from the police. You will see surveillance videos that capture evidence of further concealment of controlled substances.
Witnesses on day one included Jenna Scurry, an emergency dispatch operator who was watching the scene play out on CCTV and became so distressed by what she was seeing that she felt the need to alert her superiors.
In your experience, you felt something was wrong here that a sergeant needed to know about.
Correct. If this was a form of use of force, I was calling to let them know.
Have you ever, in your career before, called a sergeant for something like this?
Multiple. For an incident like this?
Right.
To be exact, no.
And at the end of day one, martial arts fighter Donald Williams, who happened to be passing the scene at the time, and along with another bystander, a healthcare first responder, warned police officers they were choking the life out of Mr. Floyd.
And that report from our correspondent Simon Marks. After being wedged across the Suez Canal for almost a week, the giant container ship, the Ever Given, has been refloated and freed. Carrying 18,000 containers, it took 13 tugboats and the removal of tens of thousands of tonnes of sand to free the vessel. The BBC's Darshini David has more.
For 6 days, it's gripped and confounded the world. But the bottleneck sealing one of the busiest shipping lanes has been uncorked. The Ever Given, owned by company Evergreen, is finally on the move, thanks to a fleet of tugboats, diggers and an exceptionally high tide. Moving the ship was never going to be easy. The 150-year-old canal is less than 300 metres wide. By contrast, the megaship is 400 metres long and 20 times heavier than the Eiffel Tower. Almost 30,000 cubic metres of mud have had to be shifted. Carrying 20,000 containers, the Ever Given is the answer to our growing shopping list. A similar number of ships go down the canal as did 40 years ago, but now they're carrying more than 3 times as much. Around 52 go through every day, accounting for around 12% or £7 billion of global trade. Now, behind the Ever Given, there have been more than 300 vessels queuing. Their cargo, everything from food to medicine to livestock and cars. They too may have more trouble on the horizon.
There is a large backlog of vessels that are waiting to go through the canal from both sides. And I think even operating at full capacity, it's going to take probably at least several weeks to get back to normal. And in the meantime, of course, vessels that are starting off that were due to travel through the canal at the moment will continue to be diverted.
The Ever Given and its cargo was due to arrive in Felixstowe next week, but its customers and many others still await an ETA.
That was Darshini David reporting. A number of you getting in touch about the change-up in rules for exercise buses at MIQ. This person says exercise opportunities should be televised to each room 3 times a day using the motel internal video channel. No leaving the room for any reason. And oh yes, they should pay for their quarantine upon arrival. Taxpayers should not carry the debt. No people from places where COVID is out of control. For example, India, Brazil and even the UK. And even if they're New Zealand citizens, they should get their full vaccine program in the country they reside or work in. Plenty of you are also confused by the change in rules and say we're adverse to risk at the border, so why do we continue to have these buses? We're back tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Immigration lawyer Matt Robson claims a group of Chinese nationals awaiting deportation for working illegally at Auckland building sites are exploited workers who should be protected. The brother of a Ports of Auckland worker who died on the job fears for the safety of friends still working there if CEO